Okay. We're in the next to last week of our macro course, and I want to talk in this video uh, more on the subject of productionism and consumptionism. Now, this work is taken from George Reisman's Capitalism, that you all have a copy of, or have access to a copy of. And it's actually chapter 15, I believe. Here I'm going blank on this because I don't have it in front of me, and I should have it in front of me, but I think that's chapter 15. Now, no, I'm sorry, it's chapter 13. Chapter 13. Chapter 15 is our other aggregate demand and so forth. So I want to talk about, especially in this chapter, about productionism and consumptionism, because I get the sense from reading some of your assignment reports that you are confusing certain things, especially when you attempt to discuss consumptionism and productionism. Now, productionism is not producers, and consumptionism is not consumers. Although they are related, they're not synonyms for each other, but they are related, but not synonyms. And some of you migrated into using them as synonyms for each other. So productionism is the understanding that the fundamental problem of economic life is how to steadily increase the ability to produce in the face of a limitless need and desire for wealth. Productionism also includes its implications on the understanding of the effects of the use of machinery, advertising, a rise in the birth rate, foreign trade, imperialism, war, and government spending. So we're going to look at some of the implications from the productionism's point of view. Remember, this is a concept. And from the consumptionist point of view. If you believe in consumptionism, you adhere to a certain way of thinking. If you believe in the productionism view here, you believe in a certain way of thinking. Now, I want to say right at the first that many of you have tried to walk some kind of a balance between these two concepts for fear of taking a side. And you are committing great fallacies when you do that. You can be a consumptionist, but if you're a consumptionist, you believe in a big government, you believe in the right of the government to coerce individuals and force them to do things and consume things against their will. If you believe in these things, then you are a consumptionist, then you are a Keynesian. That's okay. I don't think you can really support that position. I think your arguments will be riddled with fallacies, but you can support that decision. I think I've said in other videos that if I supported consumptionism, then I would start out with the premise that because of my, let's just say, because of my family, that because of my birthright, I have the right against all of the rest of you to initiate physical force against you and force you to do things against your will. None of you have that right. Only I have that right because of my birth to a particular family. Now, I can start from that premise, and then I can justify and say that the non-aggression axiom is not a valid axiom, and unless we apply it to the rest of the universe other than me and exempt myself. Now, that would be a logical presentation. It may not make a lot of sense, it may not fit reality, but it would be illogical and true if we maintain that. I don't think any of you take that position. And by the way, I certainly don't. I don't think any of you take that position. But if you believe that the non-aggression axiom is fallacious or faulty or not true, then I say by implication that you take some of these ridiculous, absurd ideas. So let's proceed on here and look at some of this. But again, I've seen that many of you have tried to walk a balance between this productionism concept and the consumptionist aspects. And remember, these are the creations of George Reisman. I think very good creations to help illustrate and give us a better understanding of economics and these concepts. The propositions of classical economists that are associated with productionism. It turns out that the classical economists had many, many, many things correct, at least as how it related to the real world. The importance of division of labor in raising the productivity of labor. Comparative advantage plus the limitless need for wealth guarantees a place for everybody in the division of labor, provided only that individual freedom exists. This is why I am such a stickler for the non-aggression axiom, because the non-aggression axiom by itself, everything follows from that of individual freedom. The quantity theory of money that the classical economists had is a very useful idea. Say's law of markets. Now we're going to work right up to Say's laws of market, and we're not going to get into that, at least in this video, because we use the potato example for those of you that have gone on and read about that and try to talk about that. That potato example, I plan to do a video. I don't know whether I'll have it done for this course yet or not, on the potato example, because it illustrates so many, it illustrates the whole working of a free market. So we're going to learn how production and supply, and only production and supply, create purchasing power and thus demand for its demand in its real sense. The real sense means the goods and services a monetary demand can actually buy. Now I know that this monetary demand and the real demand and monetary demand can be a little bit confusing, but if it is, it's because we don't fully understand money. Now, that first bullet point, that only production and supply create purchasing power and thus demand in its real sense. Some of you want to take the position that, oh, consumption is very important. Consumption is important. You and I could not survive if we did not consume. I think there will be some questions, a couple of questions, true-false questions on tests that says that individuals have to produce, true or false, or individuals have to consume, true or false. And I may be miswording that, so I won't go on with that example, or I'll mislead you, and then you'll blame me for missing it on the test. But what I want to get across here is that you are unable to consume. Give me an example. Give me an example in the real world where production didn't come first. Give me an example in the real world. Let's go back to Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is out there, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago. Maybe he's standing where you're living right now. He's standing there. What's around you? Basically nothing. What is his immediate need? He needs to survive. So he picks an apple from the tree to eat it. He had to produce that apple. He had to use labor to pick that apple. How about catching a fish? He had to either use his hand to catch that fish, or he had to produce a pole, a fishing pole to catch that fish, or produce a net to catch that fish. Production always comes before consumption. It has to do. It's the way the real world operates. It's our reality of us being here on planet Earth. We may wish that it would be something else, but that's how the real world works. We're going to understand that the existence of a general overproduction, i.e. an excess of aggregate supply over aggregate demand, is impossible. It's impossible. It cannot happen. It cannot happen without government intervention in the market, doing all kinds of distorting all kinds of things. It cannot happen in a free market. Then we will see how mass unemployment is a result of government intervention, not the working of the capitalist economy itself. If you leave this course understanding only that, I would consider my efforts a great success. Profitability of business. Again, as we see, we're going to learn that the productive process generates an aggregate real demand that is equal to aggregate supply and grows precisely as aggregate supply grows. But will there be anything left over for profit? And the answer is yes. Now, we're not going to go into detail on this, but you should sleep better at night understanding that in a free market, unhampered by government, that there will be an aggregate real demand that equals supply and grows so that there will be a profit. Okay. Now, here's some more doctrines of classical economists that we need to learn that support and are supported by productionism. This concept of productionism, in the bottom line says that production is the essential aspects. Not that other things are not important, but it says that production has to be first. And of course, we all need to consume. You and I don't have, we have to produce in order to be able to consume. Saving. So another thing to learn here that the classical economists provided for us and that is totally left out of Keynesianism. By the way, Keynesianism and consumptionism, you're going to see are parallel concepts of each other. Keynesianism does not believe in savings, doesn't want savings. It considers savings a leakage out of the system, etc., etc. One of the things that you're going to learn here, the productionism shows, and that if you read here in either Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State or read George Reisman's Capitalism, you're going to see that what is saved is spent. And in fact, you're going to see that saving, the spending of saving, is the largest expenditure in the economy, far out exceeding the consumption spending in an economy. Savings is the source of most spending in the economic system, not consumption, and most importantly, underlies both a growing aggregate real demand for goods and services and a growing aggregate monetary demand for them. Savings is important. It is the bottom line. We have to have it. Real wages and the standard of living. Real wages and thus the standard of living are determined by the productivity of labor. This idea is just Say's law applied to wages. Real wages are determined by production, just as the real demand for goods is determined by production. Maybe I'll say this at this time. I've said it in some of the other videos, but and maybe I'll repeat it as I'm reminded of it as we go through here. If you think of our economic system as one in which there is a big pot of goods and services that exist out there, and that you, in producing whatever good and services you do, you're placing that good or service into a big pot. You get paid at the end of the day, and you have money, cash, dollars. Most of you, it'll be dollars. You have dollars, and those dollars are a claim on what? They're a claim on those items that are in the pot. The more production, the more you put in the pot, the more claim you have on what's in the pot. Right. So, that's why you always have to produce before you can consume. Consuming is taking from the pot. So you take your dollars, those are your claims on what's in the pot, and you buy those things from the pot. You take those things from the pot that you desire. It is a little more difficult to see maybe because money is involved. But our basic reality is that we are a barter economy, a barter society, that we produce goods and then exchange those goods for other goods. Money helps us facilitate that exchange. Hopefully you picked that up from the money videos that were produced. That money simply facilitates that transaction. It does not change the reality. Thus, okay, production versus consumption here. A growing influence of irrationalist philosophy, which denies human reason. Man is just another animal. Okay. Consumptionism takes the view that government has to get involved because our needs and desires are limited. Now, think about that. Think about that. Are your wants and desires, needs and desires, are they limited? I would guess that your needs and desires are unlimited. Just think about all the things. If your income were doubled, would you be able to spend it? Consumptionism, Keynesianism says no, possibly not. Government's got to step in and take care of this because your needs and wants are limited. All right, let me triple your income. Would you be able to spend it? How about quadruple? How about 10 times? How about 100 times your income? Would you be able to spend it? Now, tell me honestly. So therefore, we see right at the first that that's a ridiculous implication from consumptionism or Keynesianism that your needs and desires are limited. Now, some of you have gotten very well the understanding there of what Keynesianism says. Keynesianism says that there's an aggregate demand out here, and then there's an aggregate supply. And that sometimes that aggregate demand is not big enough to purchase the aggregate supply. Because capitalism is so efficient, it is so productive, that it can produce more than we wish to consume. That is nonsense, people, and it should be eliminated right then, and you should see that consumptionism or Keynesianism falls right there on that issue. Thus, disregarding the profound influence the profession of reason exerts on other aspects of human life. If man is like an animal, then his needs and desires must be as limited as the animal and not extend beyond the minimum necessities. I usually talk about that. I spent many years in the western states, and I would go out on hunting expeditions or whatever and spend many hours observing animals. And nowhere have I ever come up on a meadow, a nice meadow, green meadow, where I found deer mowing that meadow and putting up hay for them to use. Those deer are still living the same way that they lived for all of their existence. They live by instinct. They do have demand to eat that grass, and they do have demand to eat those things, but it comes from instinct, and that they know how to survive, and that for however mechanism it is, that's how that they've developed over time. Whereas man, we have learned through reason how to improve our lives by producing more things that we desire. So, the consumptionist view is that human beings are no different than animals and that their desires are limited. Consumptionism. But man's desires do extend beyond the minimum, and this is held to be the result of social conditioning, artificial, unnatural, created. So this is the answer if you ask a Keynesian or consumptionism about this issue. He'll say, oh, certainly man does increase their desires, but it's artificial, It's through social conditioning. It's not real. It's unnatural. It's created. Thus, the basic economic premise follows that the need and desire to consume are essentially fixed and given, and the ability to produce threatens to constantly overrun them. If you look, we're going to have a graph of that a little bit later, but some of you have already recognized that. So you've already read in the book, and you remember there's two vertical lines there. There's two vertical lines, and they are separated. And that separation is what the Keynesians and what consumptionism says that government needs to fill. Got to have government coming in. Consumption is the doctrine that the fundamental problem of economic life is how to increase the need and desire to consume in the face of ability to produce that exceeds them. So you and I, according to the consumptionists, according to the Keynesians, you and I have limited needs and desires, and therefore we've got to be helped along here. Basically, it's better to let government come in and do it because government knows what we really should have and really do need. Now, folks, I challenge that. If you think I'm wrong about that, challenge that thought. Challenge it. You know, I'll be happy to look at it. Put it in the discussion board. The error of unintended consequences is the error of considering the effects of things only on those most directly concerned and neglecting the effects on the rest of the economic system. Now, this fallacy is basically throughout economics. If the demand for the output of one industry increases, then consumer spending will be challenged from other industries into this industry. And therefore, applying a fallacy of composition there, we might say, aha, I can see that, boy, big increases in the demand for the Apple's iPad, that really did great things for the Apple. It increased their earnings, it increased their stock price, it increased their earnings. My goodness, they employed more people. Well, that's what ought to happen to the whole economy. Let's just increase the demand for all of the goods in the economy, just like what happened to Apple. Well, can't do that. You cannot do that. That is a fallacy there, because that increased demand, that increased real demand, I'm going to say here, not the monetary demand, because that may be a different issue with government pumping money into the money supply. That real demand that Apple experienced, that real increase in demand that Apple experienced, came from another part of the economy. Something else was being purchased less. We don't necessarily know what it was exactly. It could have been other electronic goods, or it could have been food, wine, other types of entertainment. We don't know necessarily what that is. This can lead one to the wrong conclusion that all that is needed is the increase in the need or desire for products in general to increase general demand for all products. This is a fallacy of composition. The invalid generalizing from what occurs in the part of a system to the system as a whole. Not understanding that an increase in the demand for the product of one industry means an increase in the demand for the products, a decrease in the demand for the products of the other industries. The mistake of concluding that because at any given time a particular industry could experience an increase in demand by virtue of the need or desire for its products relative to the needs and desire for the products of other industries, that all industries might gain in this way at the same time. That's my example of Apple. Clearly there was an increase in the demand for products of Apple. There had to be a comparable decrease in the demands for others given at this time. This would be the case of adding up as additional demand what are in fact a series of mutually exclusive alternatives. Confusing the need and desire for goods with demand for the goods. Now, there is a relationship between the need and desire for goods and demand for goods. That relationship is production and supply of the goods, individual income. An individual can have all the need and desire for goods, But if he doesn't have the ability, i.e. the income to acquire them, then there's no demand. So, if you say, well, look, I want that Mercedes, I want that new Cadillac, I want that new Ford, I want that new, but I can't buy that right now, I can't do that. Well, it's because you haven't produced enough. It is because you have either what you've produced has not been valued by those people that are buying from you what you're produced, or whatever the reason is. But the bottom line is that we don't produce enough. I would love to have a lot more things, and the reason that I can't have them is not because of the system, it is because I have not produced for a society out here that wants what I have to produce. So production or supply, again, we say, must precede demand. So my demand and desire for a Mercedes without the ability to buy a Mercedes is not really the demand. Now, a return to mercantilism. Keynesianism is basically a return to mercantilism. This consumptionism doctrine here is a return to mercantilism. Economists, largely under the influence of Lord John Maynard Keynes and other intellectuals who are not familiar with economics, have returned to mercantilism, the view that Adam Smith attacked in his Wealth of Nations that he wrote and published back in 1776. Easy date to remember. And his book was called The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. At that time, what mercantilism was, is that nations, or the idea was that a nation's prosperity was the amount of precious metals that they had in their coffers. Therefore, as a result of that, you only desired to export your goods. You did not desire to import your goods. Your only desire was to import. Why? Because when you sold something to somebody else, i.e. imported that good, they paid you in gold. And so gold flowed in as a countering balance against that transaction. By the way, balance of payments applies to individuals in the same way. The goods and services that you produce out there is like an export. If you work for Ford Motors, you go to work every day, you export your services, whatever that skill and service is that you provide for them, and what you import is money. Or you're importing the goods and services that money will buy. And so that can be related. And if you look at my PowerPoint presentation or read especially in Mary Rothbard, you will see that fully developed. It gives you a much better understanding of balance of payments, and in some ways how ridiculous that they have, how that accounting process has become. Instead of taking the need and desire to consume for granted and focusing on the ways and means to increase production, the problem of economic life is now often believed to be how to expand the need and desire to consume, sending us totally down the wrong track, which is what Keynesianism has done in the field of economics. The problem of economic life is how to produce more wealth, not how to produce more consumption. Depression and alleged overproduction. Well, the Keynesian philosophy is that because there is this, capitalism is so efficient, so productive, that it causes an overproduction, and therefore then that results in a depression. A variant of the doctrine claims that while the need and desire may be present, the ability to buy them is lacking because people do not possess a corresponding large quantity of money. And therefore we need to inflate, i.e., what's inflation? It's increase the money supply. So you see where our inflationary policies that we have today, i.e. all of the quantitative easing, which are other ways of saying how do we increase the money supply in the economy, because the belief is, with this consumptionist belief or this Keynesian belief, is that all you have to do to create wealth is increase the money supply, because they're equating that medium of exchange, that all it's been invented to do is to facilitate our ability to exchange rather than being in a barter economy. They've taken that medium of exchange to be wealth. Now, we do use that as sometimes a symbol of wealth, but it's not the wealth. The wealth of a nation is the goods and services that it can produce. It is the capital goods. It is the factories. It is the machines. It is the tools. It is the skilled labor. That's the roads, the buildings, all of these things. That's the wealth of a nation, not how much money you have in your coffers. Which was the mercantilist view. So you see that consumptionism, Keynesianism is a return to that. Now I'll try to move along a little bit here. Here is that consumptionist view of the economic world that I've talked about here. On the vertical axis we have price level. On the horizontal axis we have output. The Keynesians, the consumptionists say that, look, here is our demand, aggregate demand, because of the limited needs and desires of people. And capitalism's productivity and ability to produce, it produces at S, and therefore there is an overproduction there by amount AB in our example here. Here is the productionist aggregate demand curve. That aggregate demand curve can be drawn in many different ways here. It's just drawn here to represent that this is a demand curve that is drawn in this way. It happens to be a unitary demand curve, but that's irrelevant, just to illustrate a point here. Price level is still plotted on the vertical level. Output is still produced, are still represented on the other axis. Now, I'll wait till we apply some aggregate supply curves to that, but you can see that whatever the aggregate supply of the economy is, there will be an intersection, and there will be an equilibrium there. And that means that everything supplied the quantity of the amount that's supplied will just be equal to the quantity demand. And how that adjustment comes about is it comes about through the price level. Doesn't that make sense? That if somebody produces something and it isn't selling, what do? You lower the price. If you produce something and, my goodness, you can't keep it in stock, you can't produce it fast enough, what do? You raise the price. That's the productionist approach here. This is a representation of that. General overproduction is impossible. We will expand on this later, but it should be obvious that in the very nature of the productionist aggregate demand curve and its foundations, that a general overproduction is impossible. Now, note the inherent absurdity of this idea that there can be an overproduction in the economy. Now, that's not saying that an industry can't overproduce. That's not saying that a company can't overproduce. Say's law doesn't say that you can go out there and produce anything you want and there's going to be a demand for it. That's not what Say's law says. You know that's absurd. But for the economy as a whole, there cannot be an overproduction. Some of the implications of this idea is that people cannot afford homes or apartments because they have built too many of them. That aggregate demand curve not meeting that aggregate supply curve, that's what it's saying. The aggregate supply curve produced all these homes and apartments, but people can't afford them because they built too many. They cannot buy food because they've grown too much. They cannot purchase cars or appliances because they've manufactured too many, or they are poor because they are rich. They're rich because of, look what they produced. They have all of that production now to go out into the marketplace and buy that production. Remember, all of that production went into that pot. And they all got paid for it. And therefore that pay, those dollars, that money unit, was a claim on what's in the pot. So that'll always balance out. Machinery and unemployment. One of the implications of the consumptionist view is that a machine can now produce a given quantity of goods with less labor than machinery has caused unemployment. The Ricardo effect was that a rise in wages will encourage capitalists to substitute machinery for labor and vice versa. Not true in a strict sense. So let's look at that a little bit. Now, here's the consumptionist view of the economic world. I would like not to go into this. I want you to do it. There's plenty of explanation here in the slides to let you know how to do this. But let me just start out at the top here. There's the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. At the bottom, we have the old production function as that straight line, and we have the new production function with machinery at the lower portion. What that says, that with the machinery now at every level of employment, they can turn out more. However, under this consumptionist view of how the economic world works, that is that aggregate demand, aggregate supply that you see at the top, it produces unemployment. It produces unemployment. That is fallacious. That's not how the real world works. And we would, for no other reason, discard that immediately. There is no basis for any of you trying to justify some kind of a wonderful median life here, or, well, on this hand, consumptionism does this, and on this hand, productionism does this. Nonsense. Nonsense. George Reisman has done a very adequate job, even if I'm not doing an adequate job of presenting it, of showing you in the text the fallacious nature of consumptionism throughout. And you can relate it almost on a one-to-one basis with Keynesianism. So I don't think that any of you can make an argument of why, on one hand, the Keynesians, they're right here in this area, and on the other hand, the Austrians or the non-Keynesians are right on the other. And by bull. Keynesianism is fallacious at its foundation, and on nearly every aspect of it, it is fallacious. It has been shown to be fallacious through many scholarly writings in the past. And those videos with Tom Woods and others that I've pointed to usually point this out. Now, I can understand that if you've not had a lot of background, that you don't see that as easily, that it doesn't come forth, and you don't want to take that position. Here, we see that we can have that increase in new machinery, and it causes the aggregate supply curve to move out to the right, more goods and services in your economy. That's what we want, isn't it? Wouldn't we be better off in the world today if there was a doubling of all of the automobiles, all of the food, all of the houses, all of the buildings, all of the factories? If there was a doubling of all of those things, wouldn't we be better off? If there were twice as many biscuits in the world as there are today, wouldn't we be better off? Well, the answer is yes to that question. Now, we can argue about whether we ought to even be eating biscuits, but that's another issue. This shows how price would fall here. Price would fall from that initial SD intersection to the S prime D intersection. Price would fall, and there would be a balancing, and all would be right of the world. So we want to have more new machinery. I'll just point out, most of you are in that Michigan area of automotive industry. Are you going to tell me that the unemployment rate in the world today in the automotive industry is it should be nearly zero? Should be no one employed in the automotive industry with all of the machines that have been added. Now, some of you want to say, well, to be honest, I think the automotive employment is higher. That's another issue that we'll get into here later. So it's the marginal utility, silly misrepresentation that machinery is substituted for labor. What happens is that labor is made more efficient by the aid of machinery. That's exactly what happened in the early part of the 20th century as Henry Ford added more and more machines to his factory, made his employees more and more productive, and they turned out more and more automobiles. What happened? The prices of them went down. Well, that was sort of a luxury good at the time, and people really wanted more automobiles. So what they do? The demand, or the quantity demand, either way you look at it, increased. And so those adding more machines actually caused an increase in the employment in the automotive industry. Contrast that to the example of the potato industry, and you will see that an increase in the productivity in the potato industry caused a reduction in the employment in the potato industry. And that is the difference between the type of good that we have, an inferior good, potatoes versus a luxury good, automobiles. At least automobiles at that time. I'm not sure what they would be today. I think it's probably the same. But the automobile, those two, it happens to do with the elasticity. Remember the concept of elasticity coming in here? So elasticity comes in, and so the introduction of machinery in one industry caused an increase in employment, whereas an increase in machinery in one industry caused a reduction in employment in that industry. But that was good, because why? That if it's not hampered by government labor rules, i.e. government intervention in the market, then the employment in the potato industry, they move out and go into employment in other industries, maybe the automotive industry. In real terms, everybody is better off. In real income, everybody's is better off in labor, because labor is a scarcer good relative to capital, and therefore its income increases in real terms. Machinery leads to a higher standard of living. I've basically already said that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the productivity of labor has increased by an order of magnitude of at least 100%, but the unemployment rate is not in the order of 99%, which the machinery causes unemployment idea that comes from consumptionism implies. So the unemployment rate is no higher today than it was in the 18th century, even with the many-fold increase in population and the use of machinery. As the labor-saving improvements are adopted in industries providing necessities or any other goods of which relatively little more is wanted, employment in those industries falls. Example is agriculture. Okay, and I think I've already covered this concept, so let me move along. Some modern examples. I've already talked about the automotive industry. Through productive geniuses such as Henry Ford and Alfred P. Sloan, the quantity of labor required to produce an automobile was greatly reduced, and the automobile was available to millions of buyers, and therefore there was an increase in employment in the automotive industry. Now, consumptionism, implied from consumptionism, is that there will be an inherent group conflicts over employment. The notion of a limited demand for goods leads to the belief that there is, when it comes to employment, an inherent group conflict between men versus women, immigrants versus natives, Protestants versus Catholics, and you can go on, and we see it even today. We see that even today. And you can use that previous diagram of productionism to refute that example, that we actually would encourage more and more immigrants to come to this country to work. Because why? We're not interested in their consumption. We're interested in what they're able to produce. So underlying these ideas that there's a conflict is consumptionism. That's a fallacy. That's why you can reject consumptionism as something that you don't want as your primary belief. And the same goes with Keynesianism. Only government can produce the group conflict over employment. Only government does that. We see it today of our politicians running for office, and they're trying to create group conflict between the rich and the non-rich. Ridiculous. Make work and spread the work schemes, feather bedding by unions, requiring, for example, requiring skilled electricians to turn on and off lights. So you're in a factory, you heavily unionized, you want to turn off the lights. No, can't do that. You've got to call a union member to come and turn those lights off. Now, I have been teaching over the last several years students that work for Ford. Most of these, or almost all of these, are union workers. I bring up these examples and they have no idea what I'm talking about. I point out to them, and these are historical facts. I worked in the steel company. I know about this skilled electrician to turn on and off certain things. I know that. I don't remember it, that in the office that I couldn't turn off the lights, but certainly out in the mill, in many of those things that you really didn't need to have a skilled electrician do, but it was required that you use a skilled electrician to do it. I know that from personal experience. There is the classic example that's probably used to be in many textbooks and many other works talking about the labor movement, is feather bedding from the standpoint of when our railroad industry moved from the coal-burning engines to diesel engines. There was a fireman whose responsibility was to make sure that there was always coal or oil or whatever it was that they burned in those. It was wood at one time. I know out west from my living out there, when the railroads came through, that through union contracts it required that fireman remain hired there. What did he do? I don't know. They probably had to do some menial task. But what these things do is they lower the standard of living and lower productivity. And it results in unemployment. Please understand this if you don't, and I know that I may be speaking to a group out here that might be heavily unionized. And that is that unions produce unemployment. And they produce a lower standard of living. Maybe not for their members. Maybe not for their members. But for the rest of the society. War and government spending. According to the consumptionist view, is that war is good because it destroys things and they get to be rebuilt back. It's that replacement. It's the pin-up demand that's created by the war. Now, these things are all absurd, and it's based on the belief of limited need and desire. Okay. World War II comes to mind here. Can you even believe in our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, that over there blowing up tanks or whatever these new wheeled vehicles are that run around and get blown up here, that's good for our economy because it does produce employment back here? It is true. If you are the truck manufacturer of those vehicles, you will become filthy rich. But we're talking about the economy as a whole. And from the economy as a whole standpoint, it lowers our standard of living. It destroys wealth. That wealth could have gone into building automobiles. It could have gone into building computers. It could have gone into building cars, appliances, all of those things. Instead, it was destroyed over there in the deserts of someplace, you know, and whatever else that comes to it. Consumption implies that prosperity depends on the absence of wealth, that poverty follows from wealth's abundance. The poverty follows, you get a lot of wealth out here and everything shuts down. It puts people unemployed here because you got all these machines working. All because that priceless commodity, consumer desire, more limited in supply than diamonds, is produced by the absence and consumed by the presence of wealth. Ridiculous, absurd thinking. Productionism recognizes the need for wealth is always superabundant. No need to destroy existing wealth. Wealth must be created, not the need for wealth. War destroys existing wealth. The economic effect of war diverts production from civilian goods to war goods, which have no economic benefit. There's a drop in the standard of living caused by the diversion of output to the war effort. Post-war replacement of wealth needlessly destroyed in war is at the expense of new and additional wealth that otherwise could have been enjoyed in addition to the wealth needlessly destroyed. War does not promote prosperity by wartime technological advances. People think, oh, all that technology that comes out of the war effort, it produces all these things. Science and technology efforts made during wartime were at the expense of science research made for peaceful use. Scientists and engineers were diverted from peacetime pursuits to war effort. Countries which have been free to devote their efforts to improving human life and well-being have, as a byproduct, developed far more powerful military technology than countries bent on war and aggression, i.e., the U.S. is an example of that, maybe a bad example. War does not promote prosperity by replacing destroyed factories and machines with more advanced factories and machines. The foundation for the construction of a new factory and machine is existing factories and machines. It was the factories and machines of the U.S. that facilitated the rebuilding of Germany and Japan after World War II. Their own factories and machines, which were not destroyed, aided in this rebuilding. Accumulation relative to Europe and Japan if it had not been for the factories that were not destroyed in the U.S., it would have been a lot more difficult to recoup after World War II than it was. Consumptionists see government spending as source of prosperity. Spending for public works or for social welfare allegedly benefits employment like war. Since there's no lack of demand for goods or need for labor, government spending diverts production from goods that people voluntarily choose to buy to goods and services that they would not voluntarily buy. Anything the government produces and provides out there, it is something that we have voluntarily chosen not to buy or not to rank very high on our value scales and therefore are not doing it. It is some politician or bureaucrat that has said, these people should have this, and then they force us into having it by taking away from us part of our output, part of what we would have, part of what we placed into that pot of goods and services. They've taken part of our claim away from us and have given it to somebody else, either corporations or other individuals, but certainly not ourselves. Population growth and demand. Consumptionists claim that a larger number of people increase the total demand for goods. Productionists would say that a larger number of people increase the total production and gives us a higher standard of living. So this helps to eliminate the alleged excess of the ability to produce over the need and desire to consume. So you see, the consumptionist says, remember that gap between the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve? Well, if we have more population in here, it'll help increase that aggregate demand. It'll help increase it. Thus, what is supposed to be the cause of prosperity with this increased population is that additional people exist only as consumers, not as producers. That is, they exist as parasites. In reality, it will only be by virtue of their production and not by their virtue of their desire to consume that this increased population will be able to constitute an additional market. You know, back in the early days when people were talking about, well, we'll talk about that in a minute here. A few more slides here. Imperialism and foreign war. That's what I was wanting to get to say that this belief in a larger population at home being desirable makes it desirable to secure the needs and desires of the vast, impoverished population of backward foreign countries. They used to talk about what a great market China would be with all of those people there. It'd be great. Well, those people couldn't afford to buy anything. What are you talking about? The value of that vast population is what they can produce and add to the world's supply of goods and services. That will be the real benefit, not their ability to consume. Now, of course, their ability to consume is going to enter into this, but it is not the primary cause. The primary is their production. This is what consumptionism reverses. It puts the primary as consumption, and the secondary as production, and then the real world, that's reversed. So consumptionism, by that view alone, should be nixed and out the window. Historically, this absurd idea undoubtedly influenced economically ignorant politicians in embarking upon policies of imperialism and colonial conquest. Therefore, this idea of consumptionism probably led to far more wars of aggression and colonialization that a lot of people who espouse to the virtues of consumptionism argue against. And so their ignorance there are arguing for a philosophy or supporting a philosophy that actually gives them what they don't want. Obviously, the notion that an excess of exports over imports constitutes a favorable balance of trade is entirely consistent with consumptionism. This, quote, favorable balance of trade is nonsense, but it's been carried on in economics. Look in your own textbook, and you will see that they have done a pretty good job of dispelling this idea. I'll have to give them credit for that in the international section. Thus, only exports are important, but I hear this all the time. You'll see it. You'll see this bias in the news all the time. Oh, it's awful that the U.S.'s imports are so much greater than their exports. Well, let me ask you this question. If what you produce is your exports, and what you receive in exchange is your imports, which is more important to you? Is it the work you do, that you have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and take care of your family and then go do? It may require you to be away all week. By the way, I'm just playing back some of the emails that I get from you talking about all these hardships that you go through. I understand those hardships. That's the production aspect. That is your export efforts out there. Do you like that? Well, I would say that if you have a choice, no, you wouldn't. You'd much rather enjoy the other side of it, where you get to go out and buy widescreen TVs and buy a new car and buy better food and a better house, all of these things. That's what you really enjoy. So this idea that the consumptionist says that exports are more important than imports is hogwash. We're interested in what are the goods and services that we can buy from foreign countries, or wherever they're from. I don't like that distinction a lot, but that's how we look at it. So the only conclusion that can be drawn from this is the country benefits by virtue of actually giving its goods away for free, by working and sending them out, and by receiving back as little as possible. That's what Consumptionism, that idea, and that's what Keynesianism, basically that's what goes on. In international trade, the actual benefit of international trade is in the imports, not the exports. The citizens of a country gain because the benefits of the goods brought in by international trade surpass the goods and services that labor and capital employed in producing exports to pay for these could produce for the domestic market. There's the marginal utility of those goods that come in exceed the marginal utility lost of those goods that are going out, otherwise you wouldn't do it. International trade, like machinery, causes a higher productivity of labor and standard of living. The effect on employment is merely a change in the pattern of employment. Parasitism as an alleged source of gain to victims. The consumptionist view on the alleged benefit effects of war, government spending, population growth, and imperialism rests on the idea that one benefits producers by the mere fact of consuming their products. In other words, the producer doesn't benefit from receiving the products of the consumer, but only from the consumer's consuming. Remember that in the real world, it's really a barter economy. Is that we exchange what we produce to those producers for the goods that they produce. We produce goods and services that we exchange to other producers for their goods and services. That's what this is saying. But what consumptionism says is that no, you don't benefit from receiving the goods from the other producers. You only benefit from their consumption of your goods. You send those goods out for their use, but you don't get anything back. And this is obviously absurd. The use of money probably helped, as I indicated before, formulate this view. If it were true, then every slave who ever lived should have cherished his master's every whim which required of him more work. In other words, the slave was the producer producing that service for the master. And that under the consumptionist view, it's implied that the slave should cherish the master's benefiting from that, not for anything that he got in return. The belief that the consumption of the government or of private non-producing consumers at home or abroad benefits and helps to support the economic system is on precisely the same footing as the belief that the consumption of the master benefits and supports the slave. This is an absurd belief and produces much injustice in the world. Another reason for totally rejecting this concept of consumptionism and Keynesianism. Not to try to say, oh, on this hand, consumptionism does this, and on this hand, consumptionism does this. And by the way, I know that some of you, I saw this time and time again. You talked about, somebody talked about an employee in your local grocery store that was working in the produce department, and you called that person a consumer. And confusing that with this consumptionist idea. That person is a producer. As his function there in the grocery store, he's a producer. He produces that service. It might be for Kroger or Safeway or some other a large grocery store, but he is a producer. Now, when he gets paid at the end of the day or end of the week, then he goes out and he becomes a consumer. But you mixed up that idea, and I've seen that in several of your other writings about this, that you're confusing that, and then you're trying to say, well, the consumption is important. Absolutely, consumption is important. It's consumption for no other reason. It's important for no other reason in that we would die if we didn't consume food to eat, shelter for our clothing, whatever. We have to do that. We're forced to do that. We're not forced to save, by the way. We are forced to consume. We're not forced to save, but by the mere fact of reality, we're forced to consume. So go back and refresh your understanding of consumptionism and so forth here, and don't confuse consumer and producer. Because that example that you call that individual working in the produce market a consumer is not correct. He is a producer. And what he produces, i.e. that service there of making sure that all the fresh vegetables are on the shelf and doing all that very valuable service, he is putting that service into the big pot of goods and services. He is paid in exchange for that only because it's convenient and it's more efficient. He's paid dollars rather than some other product. He's paid the dollars. Now he takes those dollars are his claim on goods and services in the basket. And he uses those to claim whatever services that he has. And if he wants to claim more goods and services from the basket, then he needs to be more productive and provide goods and services that people want to buy. Maybe he can do that by becoming the manager of the produce department. Maybe he can increase it even more by becoming a vice president of the grocery store. Maybe he could become more important by being a general manager. You see the point there. That's how he'll be increasing his means of producing, i.e. his means of consumption. Here's a quote here by Frederick Bastiat, a French economist of the early 1800s, and that quote is, "Government is the great fiction through which everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else," end quote. Very apropos. Policy of inflation. Consumptionism gets this idea that money is the source of wealth, and that consumption is being the most important thing. Just put dollars in people's hands so they can consume more. As you know, when money is employed, producers do not exchange goods and services directly but indirectly. And this is called indirect exchange. To the extent that one consumes the product or service of others without offering product or service in exchange, one consumes at their expense. This is like stealing. None of you would agree that you should be allowed to take things that do not belong to you. I'll bet you none of you out there would send me an email or open a discussion on the discussion board there saying, "I believe that there are certain individuals who should be allowed to steal from other individuals." Well, if you buy goods, if you take from that pot of goods and services, and you didn't produce anything to put into that pot of goods and services, then you're stealing. Now, how can you do that? How can you do that? Well, you can break into somebody's house at night and steal their big widescreen TV. That's one way. That's one way that you can take goods and services out of the pot without putting anything in. Right? Okay. Another way that you can do it is for the government to increase the money supply, and you obtain that part of that increase in money supply. And then you take those dollars, they look like just all the rest, and you go buy goods and services out of that pot. You have taken something out of the pot without putting anything in. That is, by anybody's definition, and I'll bet of yours, stealing. Now, we need to spend some more time talking about that. So don't send me any emails talking about how you're not a thief, even though you probably don't even know how you might have gotten some of that. But we can talk about that, or hope to talk about that more in the money aspect of that. But there's only a certain amount of time. Every consumer must either himself have offered goods and services for sale equivalent to those he purchases, or have obtained these funds from somebody else who's done so. For everyone who spends newly created money and thus obtains goods and services without having produced equivalent goods and services, there must be others who suffer a corresponding loss. Okay? Advertising as allegedly fraudulent but economically beneficial. I'm going to click on past this. Advertising is a factor of production. It's needed to bring attention to those things that people want to sell. And so advertising is just the same as you hiring another unit of labor out there to produce the thing that you want to sell. Part of the process is to let people know what you have to sell, period. Technology here, I'll let you do this on your own. Increase in production and alleged deflation. Consumptionism implies that increases in production are responsible for depressions. You understand that gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, go back to that representation of consumptionism, that difference there is overproduction. And therefore, if it's not consumed, then people get laid off from those companies that produced all that and industries that produced those extra goods and services since they weren't bought, and therefore you have, quote, depressions. This is the belief that increases in production cause deflation unless they are accompanied by equivalent increases in the quantity of money and the volume of spending in the economic system. This is absolutely wrong, and I hope we have enough time to take care of it. Many individuals believe that falling prices in and of themselves, irrespective of their causes, represents deflation. Absolutely wrong. Deflation is by definition decrease in the money supply, period. If you have no government intervention in the marketplace, if you had increases in prices of some goods, there would have to be corresponding decreases of prices in other goods, period. Of course, in a progressing economy with more and more goods, the prices will fall. Incorrectly referred to as deflation. It's not deflation. Think of supply and demand, and think of increasing the supply. In other words, increasing the supply. You can think of all the demand for all the goods in the economy, like aggregate demand, I guess. You could think of all the supplies of goods in the aggregate supply, and you think of moving that aggregate supply to the right. That's an increase in more and more goods and services. How does that come about? It comes about through increase in productivity. It comes about through creative entrepreneurs providing a better way to produce something or to produce additional things, more goods and services, increasing that supply curve. What happens to price? To reach equilibrium, the prices would need to fall. So that's like a general price level fall. That's exactly what you want to see in a progressing economy. That's what we had in this nation in a progressing economy up until about 100 years ago, when government started to become more and more involved in the economy. With deflation and depression considered as synonyms, then there develops a fear of depressions. Consumptionism and socialism. Some individuals who hold the consumptionist believe that only under capitalism the improvement in production causes impoverishment, that war, destruction, parasitism, and fraud cause prosperity, and that conflicts exist within and between nations because of this. This absurd and discordant system, they believe, deserves to be overthrown. That's, in other words, capitalism needs to be overthrown and replaced with an allegedly more rational system. In other words, replace capitalism with socialism. To them, socialism appears, or at least it did until the collapse of the Soviet Union, as a system of reason and order in which these paradoxes and conflicts can be harmoniously resolved. The contribution of the collapse of socialism to the spread of irrationalism, i.e. the rise of environmentalism, for example, can be understood in part in the light of the influence of consumptionism. So these concepts of consumptionism have led to these ridiculous notions about how capitalism doesn't work and we need to replace it with something. And socialism was the thing. All during the 30s, you can see here in the U.S. how individuals, they misrepresented things, they lied about stuff, but that they thought that the Soviet system was the way to go. And this was consumptionist belief. To consumptionists, the collapse of socialism means that reason simply does not apply to the economic organization of mankind, and therefore we can do all kinds of irrational things. They had been convinced of the absurdity and evil of capitalism and had looked to socialism as a solution. Now, as Professor Reisman concludes, after 3 generations, they're coming to realize that socialism means slavery and poverty. They're finally beginning, but they don't really recognize it totally. It's been my experience. So the consumptionists are left with an economic world that is inescapably riddled with paradox and evil. The contribution of the collapse of socialism to the spread of irrationalism. I think I just did that. So, I think we can conclude right here on that. Consumptionism is this idea that is based on fallacious premises. They are absurd. We can look out in the real world and see that they are absurd. But they give rise, and they have consequences because they give rise to different policies. So I want to suggest to you that you think about these things. I know we have a very short time in the amount of time that we actually have in class. It's about half of the time that normal, I don't know whether to say old-fashioned universities had or traditional brick and mortar universities had. There's about twice as much time to go over these concepts. And so it is a little bit difficult. It's been a little bit difficult. I found it over my years of teaching at Northwood and at other adult programs that you have to cram so much into a very short period of time. Now, this video is approaching an hour and 20 minutes. We're at the end of it. I don't know whether you'll make it to the end of it. I guess I'll put some incentive in here to say there will be a lot of questions that will come right out of this that I have presented. You can also have gone over this, and I actually get from some of your answers to some of the questions that maybe you've gone over these slides on your own. But I have found that you have arrived, and probably, maybe justly so, I'm not blaming anything on this, that you've arrived, except that you just need a little more time to work with these and hopefully some guidance that I, as your instructor, can provide, and that's why I'm paid the big salaries that I'm paid here to do this work. Chuckle, chuckle. So anyway, use this. I hope that it is a benefit. I hope that it has been a benefit, and ask me any questions on this that you have. Do it in the discussion board so everybody can benefit. But we'll stop here at this time.